Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, and welcome to Madison's Notes. We are the official podcast of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University, and I'm your host, Laura Laurent. This week, we're going to be speaking with Robert Dreesen. Nearly 20 years, he's been with Cambridge University Press as a publisher of economics and political science. Cambridge University Press is one of the oldest publishing houses in the world, and we're going to focus in on the world of academic publishing specifically. Speaking to young scholars eager to turn their ideas, dissertations, and articles into books, I asked Dreesen what some of the biggest pitfalls are that scholars fall into when approaching this challenge. We discuss the process of formulating, submitting, reviewing, and finally getting a book deal, and to what extent external factors might impact this process. Robert Dreesen shares his reflections on academic publishing as a profession, in contrast to his time in trade publishing, and having a career in publishing and exposure in so many books. Dreesen also shares with us some of the written works he returns to over and over again for enjoyment and intrigue. So whether you're an academic or not, this is going to be an informative conversation about the way that information gets to us and how we can maybe participate in that process or just understand it for our own learning. As a final note, Robert Dreesen is coming to us today as a professional and not as an official spokesperson of Cambridge University Press. What he shares with us are his individual insights and does not make any official statements on behalf of Cambridge University Press. Welcome to Madison's Notes. It's really exciting to be here with you today. We are actually in person, which isn't always the case with Madison's Notes. And I'm just looking forward to getting to know you a little bit more, your work, and also the world of academic publishing.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
So we have a pretty broad audience for Madison's Notes, but we do have a large academic listenership. Many people who have published academic works, or they might be wanting to in the future. And I wanted to take this opportunity to talk to you, an editor of a major academic publishing firm. So first, just for an introduction, can you tell us the differences between academic publishing and trade publishing? Because you've had experience in both.
Yes. Well, there's a big difference. It's a conversation of 1,000 miles. We'd have put it that way. Trade publishing, which is commercial publishing, is for-profit publishing, right? And if they're the big trade publishers, Penguin, Simon Schuster, HarperCollins, and so forth, they answer to shareholders. So there's a lot of pressure on their bottom line, which probably makes them more enterprising. Academic publishers are so-called nonprofit publishers. They don't answer to shareholders generally. And perhaps, therefore, there isn't as much pressure on their bottom line. And in fact, a lot of smaller academic presses have endowments. They're university, Princeton University, let's say, Harvard, Yale. I suppose you could say fund certain book lines or perhaps support the press. It's not unusual. But I do want to say with Cambridge, we're unusual in the larger university press world because we not only don't have endowments, but the governing body, syndicate, we often annually contribute to the university. So we're a significant source of revenue for the University of Cambridge. And I think that is unusual. And I think perhaps with Oxford, it's the same way. I'm not sure. But I will say that I find it extraordinary, and it's one reason why it's a pleasure to work here. That puts pressure equally on our bottom line. And be the oldest publisher in the world, I think, certainly the Western world, we could easily have become irrelevant by now, if not defunct. But I'm happy to say that we're an enterprising publisher. We're a proper 21st century publisher that can compete with the best of academic publishers and in some instances with commercial publishers at many different levels. So I think that's the easiest difference between academic and commercial at the economic level, let's say.
No, that makes sense to me because I come from a design background, and sometimes having external pressures to deliver something can help maintain excellence, in that when there's other people and things to answer to, it can help push whatever it is that you're developing higher level.
Yes, I think that's right. It should be said also that there's confusion regarding defining a not-for-profit publisher. Actually, nonprofit publishers, academic publishers, let's say, certainly try to make as much profit as possible, whether it's at the top line billings and as it flows through an income statement, your gross profit and your net profit. Yeah. Of course, we're not taxed like, say, Penguin is, but it's what you do with your profits. That's the distinguishing factor in my view. So Penguin might give it back to their HarperCollins or whomever, might give a portion of the profits back to shareholders. With Cambridge, while it's true that the University of Cambridge could be seen as a shareholder, I suppose they are, largely with our profits, we turn it back into the business. And that's an important distinction with so-called non-profit publishing. And I think it's important to say also a press like Cambridge can be sold. We are part of the University of Cambridge, and that's important for authors, for example. Most of our books don't go out of print.
That's significant.
Yes. And for authors, that can be important.
Well, and I'm curious about this as I was looking over different academic publishing houses. And I work with a few of them running this podcast. I'm in contact with different people from different publishing houses to source our guests. But do different publishers have different emphases on the type of academic publishing that they do? And if so, what's the brand or emphasis that Cambridge might bring to their publishing focus?
Right. That's a good question. I think with a long answer, so I'm going to try to be brief. At Cambridge, we are a large academic publisher. And some might say that we don't fall under the distinction of a university press like North Carolina or like the University of Texas Press or Stanford. In other words, we are closer in size to a commercial press, I suppose, a commercial publisher than a lot of other publishers, Oxford equally. So that said, well, because of that, we publish a lot of different books, different models, from monographs, research volumes, to trade books, books that perhaps Penguin, let's say, would publish. Now, our trade books, we started a trade division, not a trade, a model, let's say, line of books, 5, 6, 7 years ago, and we didn't establish an imprint for these books like a normal trade house would do, and we just published them as trade books, and the sales probably in those cases don't reach that of normal trade books in commercial publishing. In fact, some of the books are coming to us in some cases if their agent had already been shown to trade publishers, but they're just not large enough. They would not garner the sales that are necessary, whereby here we can make them work. So we have these different models for books, for textbooks, and everything in between, I suppose, and journals.
What I was hearing is that Cambridge has a number of different ways that it interacts with the publishing space, in that it can both cater to specific academics, but also to more trade-like publishing. It's kind of the diversity of the different sizes and styles of publishing houses that helps get information consistently published. There's not a single thing that Cambridge is known for. They're just known for excellence at many different branches.
I think largely Cambridge is known for, and perhaps the way of putting it is a good house standard, whatever that phrase is, for monographs, research, publishing first-ranked research from researchers around the world. And that's always going to be the backbone of our list. Now, we publish many other different types of books, and of course, Cambridge University Press and Assessment is not simply about research. In fact, the research arm, the research publishing arm of Cambridge, whether it's be journals or books, represents a small percentage of what Cambridge does around the world. So Cambridge is known for research. That's what we've always done and will always do. Now, another university press, let's say I had mentioned North Carolina or the University of Nebraska Press, they might come to be known for regional publishing. Nebraska, I think, was one of the first presses possibly to capitalize or monetize their backyard, if you will, Bison Books, which is a very good paperback imprint of the University of Nebraska Press. And those books largely are about regional history, Midwest, Nebraska, Native American publishing, and so on. In North Carolina, the same way, and in the University of Texas. And so I think the typical university press will publish their own backyard, I suppose, as we say it, but also, they come to be known for excellence in area. I know, again, going to North Carolina, history. I know their history list is first rank. Cambridge's history list is first rank as well. And likewise, University of Nebraska Press. And so each university develops a competency, I suppose, and probably publishes a range of books across various competencies.
But it makes sense because Cambridge is the oldest publisher in the world, that it has many branches and many arms.
Sure. And there's so much, these university presses, it remains that most of them are very small with perhaps larger constraints, economic constraints at Cambridge.
So say I'm an academic, I have a dissertation, and I think it would make a fantastic book. But I've never written a book before, but I have written lots of articles and been published in journals, and I just haven't gotten to the book level yet. What's the process that you go through with first-time authors? Right.
Well, I suppose for a first-time book author, normally that's someone who's an assistant professor, tenure-track assistant professor. And the reason to publish a book are, in some universities, they might need, the requirement might be 2 books. A book and a journal, or a book and 2 articles, 2 books and articles. It depends. And it also depends on the discipline, whether it's economics or political science. I do social science publishing here, economics and political science largely. And so the requirements are different, but let's just assume that it's an assistant professor, tenure-track job, needing to publish a couple of articles in a book to get tenure. In most instances, or in many cases, that first book will have emerged from their dissertation. So it's a process of revising the dissertation. Now, some presses won't accept our revised dissertations. And there's a lot of work to turn a dissertation into a book. It's not unusual to hear a young scholar say, I have a book up here in my dissertation. It's a book I'd like it published, and the dissertation is not a book. And that request, the difference between 2 is definitely not lost on a publisher like Cambridge.
Yeah, so tell us a few points of how they're different.
Yes. Well, in the dissertation, you're establishing and demonstrating that you've mastered the requirements of your subfield, let's say. So, the review of the literature, you have your arms around the review of the literature. You've done what's required to make manifest, if you will, what you've learned in graduate school. And normally, I don't know, it depends. A dissertation is going to be 50,000 words, something like that. A book is going to be 85,000 words. That's on average. That's ideally, that's what we like to publish. It's a 200-page book. So you're demonstrating with the dissertation to your dissertation committee that you've mastered the requirements to get a PhD. And in many cases, then, what you're doing when you take a dissertation and revise it with the book in mind is you're throwing away the review of the literature that's no longer necessary. You are perhaps adding case studies. You're refining your analysis, expanding your theory. You need an argument that can sustain a book. And that's an important question when you are considering taking your dissertation and turning it into a book. What one doesn't want to do is force a book. It's not going to work. And it remains that most dissertations just won't work as a book. Now, there are some unusual situations where the graduate student is a good writer and wrote their dissertation with a book in mind. In most instances, that's because their committee recognized that potential and suggested, write this with a book in mind. And that's possible. Also, one must be careful about is many graduate students, elite institutions will have published a couple of articles. Articles do not make a book. You can't simply splice them together. You won't have a narrative, and that's important. And also, if you publish the articles, why would a press want to publish the book? All the research is out there, so one must be careful about that.
Yeah, unless it's some sort of compilation at the end of a career of all the essays being put together as opposed to just a few being spliced together. But it seems like one of the prevailing details is this narrative aspect of the book.
Yes.
And sort of the combining line that the arguments are connected.
Yes.
More so than just piece together things. And this leads me to my next question, because when I hear about a book deal, it's usually going to authors who have already written something and they get a book deal before they've even written the book. Like the publisher believes that they are going to write something, but it doesn't sound like that's the case with academic publishing. It sounds as though the book needs to be fully baked or like 90% baked before it is even sent to you. Is that
Yes.
correct?
Yes. With first books especially, we need to see the entire manuscript. It's hard to write a book.
It is.
And so one begins with seeing a proposal, and it's hard to write a good proposal, and that's quite telling. A proposal is like a cover letter, and there's a proper way of putting together a proposal. You need an abstract, table of contents, scope and aims, how the book fits in the literature, and ideally with the best books, not only what it adds, but how it takes the conversation forward. Mm-hmm. That's unusual, and that's ideal. But and you also need methods, case studies for which courses it might be appropriate, and what the readership is, in other words. And then the bibliography, that's a proposal, but you need to see a full manuscript. And now, for an associate professor, let's say, who's already written a book, published a book, that's not the case. A proposal and 2 sample chapters. Then this is what I require, what I prefer. Not all editors at Cambridge are the same, but generally in the social sciences and perhaps also in the humanities, I can't speak always per STEM subjects, STEM fields. They might just go forward with a proposal. I don't know. Generally, that's what we like to see. And one is able to tell fairly quickly, perhaps even from the proposal, whether it's sufficient.
And is that clarity from the preciseness and the clarity of the summarization? Because I spend a lot of time talking to academics, both for the podcast and also because I work at Princeton, so I have the benefit of speaking to people all the time about their work. And I've spoken to a few scholars who have done incredible work in their field, but as an outsider asking about their work isn't always translatable to someone who's not in their specialty. And so it's what makes a good proposal something that is very clear and straightforward. Tell me more about how you are able to discern the aptitude of the potential book through just the proposal.
Yeah. Well, what I look for initially is this young researcher well trained? Now that doesn't always have to do with the institution, but the people under which she or he worked, their advisors, they're well trained. The bones, if you will, of their book are going to be solid. And what I look for after that is, do they have their arms around their argument? Has the internal logic of their argument been worked out? I've encountered this often in conferences where you meet a lot of first-time authors. They in most cases they've contacted you a few months before a conference and shared a proposal and sample chapters with you, a manuscript, and I can learn a lot from this person in the book by how they describe in 15 minutes or 20 minutes at conference if they have their arms around their book. And one doesn't want to be reductive, but it tells me a lot. And so equally with the proposal, one is able to tell pretty quickly whether they're in possession of their argument. Yeah. And that often manifests itself in a manuscript too.
And as far as the...
I will say, just to interrupt you, I beg your pardon, I will say too that everyone has a particular readership audience that they're writing for, and the language that they use is very important. Someone in political theory, which I commissioned at Cambridge, political theorists are slightly more literary, if you will. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because they're relying on philosophy, philosophers, history of political thought. There's history there, so they have a stronger sense of narrative, I suppose. And so their readership is going to be different. They're going to be writing different. It's not going to be, they probably aren't going to have a lot of case studies. Certainly, it's not going to be methodological, rigorous. Shouldn't say rigorous, but it's
not going to be including data and
that's right.
and tables to back up their argument.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's the nomenclature that's used is often different, and that's important to keep in mind. We all have to use the language of our readership.
And that readership is more defined by the author and their intention rather than you as an editor seeing the book and saying this would be positioned towards one of the sort of reader classes that Cambridge serves?
Yeah, it can be a combination, interdisciplinary work, which is increasingly prominent, more pluralistic approach. And I personally like to promote that kind of work. I know the press does as well, because we do publish work that is specifically for a certain subfield and is excellent unto itself and isn't trying to go beyond that field. But there are a lot of researchers, young especially, who do think that their work is going to appeal to a wide readership. That's not unusual. It's seldom the case. But also that they feel that that's a plus. What's a plus for a researcher is not always a plus for a publisher. So they might say, this is a work of interdisciplinary readership, therefore you as a publisher have much more opportunity with this work. That's not always the case, because specialization lends itself to excellence for an academic and for a publisher. So if it appeals to all these different readerships, it may not appeal to them in the same way, as opposed to a very specific monograph that appeals to a very specific readership, and that makes our job as publishers much easier. A lot of books that are interdisciplinary, they fall short often, not in execution, but in finding that readership that the researcher thought she or he could access because of its interdisciplinarity.
So, well, okay, two-part question. How many proposals are you receiving on, let's say, a monthly basis? And is there a amount of books that Cambridge is hoping you will commission? What are those ratios like of how many you can handle versus how many you get?
Yeah, that's a good question, although I don't know if I can quantify it. This is a big press. It's one of the elite presses in the world. Nearly everyone wants to publish with Cambridge, or would like to be published with Cambridge. And I don't mean senior scholars, but junior scholars. Of course, we, like all other presses, have core competencies. And it's important, when I give a talk around the world on turning your dissertation into a book, for these young scholars to do their research. And just because Cambridge has this luster doesn't mean that that luster filters down to every field and every subfield. Anthropology, for example, I think we used to be strong, and now we don't really have an anthropology list. Sociology, we do have an excellent sociology list, but it's small.
And that's more reflective of the types of proposals that you're getting versus the pushing of the like some sort of internal decision that the press made.
You know, often it comes down to editors and or publishers who have working knowledge in these fields and want to develop that into a strong list and know the academics and know how to get to that content. And it's something that evolves over years. And I don't know, in sociology, we're still strong, but we don't publish anything near the number of books that we publish in political science, for example. And I think we do have probably the best book of science list in the world. And so proposals in political science, you get a lot of proposals. I don't know. I've never been able to quantify it. But, you know, at Cambridge, many editors can do their jobs without getting up from their chair. In other words, we're considered commissioning editors, that's a strong adjective that suggests going out and commissioning. That's something different. It's more active than acquiring editors, because acquiring, of course, you can commission, but acquiring, it's more passive, right? You're having
people come to you.
Yeah, and at Cambridge, that's the case. So many of us can do our jobs without going out into the world and finding content. I personally, if I may, don't, because I enjoy actively going out into the world.
Participation in that.
Yes. You have ideas, you find the scholars or researchers to implement those ideas, in other words, turn them into books, and it's much more collaborative and much more gratifying. So you receive a lot of proposals, and you get very adept at existing in possibility, what you think might work. You know the literature, you know the landscape, you know the researchers.
And you know the writer, the author knows their argument.
Sure, yes. And your ear becomes fine-tuned, I suppose, is the way to say it. And we aren't required to commission a certain number of books. There's loosely yes, but it's about revenue. Everything is about revenue, and it must be. And one needs to justify one's time and support the list, and that means commissioning a certain number of books for journals editors, bringing in a certain number of journals, I suppose. But I could commission one book a year if it were a bestseller, let's say. they say in trade publishing, the difference between the difference between a successful publisher and an unsuccessful publisher is a bestseller over 5 years, right? Well, in scholarly publishing, you generally don't get bestsellers. In other words, appearing in the New York Times book review. It's possible, but it happens very seldom. So it's hard to answer that question of what we're required to do. But it's clear, one knows if one's achieved what you're being paid to achieve, and you're active and you publish across all these different models, monograph, what we call a course adoption book. You do some research, or rather reference books, handbooks, Cambridge histories. You might do some textbooks. Most of us do all of these things.
I'm wondering, because I don't want to leave our young scholars in the dust. What might be a way for a young scholar to gauge if they have their arms around their argument, as you described? If they're wanting to build this proposal, because it's a really important moment in terms of potentially getting the book published. How can they gauge their own work to assess if it meets the high standard that Cambridge Press has?
Yes. Well, they've done all this early work in graduate school that establishes. So, in other words, they've worked with their colleagues. They've had conferences, perhaps. Now, all departments have funds to have manuscript conferences before the manuscript ever gets to me, often, in which you fly in before. Pre-pandemic, you would fly in 2 or 3 scholars and critique the manuscript and give the young scholar a lot of input. By the time it reaches me, certainly a proposal and sample chapters or my colleagues, many eyes will likely have seen that work and given the researcher input and equally suggesting perhaps editors who might be good for it, certainly publishers who might be good for it. And so they will have done the work necessary, and hopefully we'll have a good sense of which house is best, which editors are best. And one talks to one's senior colleagues, and as for the argument itself, and I think I answered that question, but again, a lot of first-rate content is coming to a press like Cambridge, and so it likely will have been exposed to the so-called piercing light of reality, right? And I don't seldom see work that's subpar or that's woefully inadequate.
Well, and this is really interesting for me to get more clarification, because when I hear the title editor, I imagine myself and my writings, and I'm like, I would hand my my draft to an editor, and there would be a collaborative dynamic. Whereas I'm seeing the differentiation, at least in this regard, with Cambridge, where a draft or your sort of first line is very different from your manuscript, which is more polished and has taken itself through more gauntlets of your network and your connections within your academic community before it even gets on the platter to be served to a publisher. So then tell me more about the review process.
Right. Well, as I suggested earlier, one knows quickly whether one is going to want to review something. And it works differently with editors and certainly at houses, how many reviews you get.
In reviewing is before it gets approved to be published, like before the book deal is signed, it goes through review.
So you've looked at some sample chapters. Let's assume, again, it's a first-time author. Look at manuscript, and you have your own readers in mind, but you also, at least I do, ask for a handful of suggestions for readers. Of course, these reviewers won't come from the author's institution, because that'd be a conflict of interest, I suppose is the way you say it. But you want fairly well-known reviewers are respected from institutions sometimes around the world. Depends on the nature of the work. And I generally like to get 3 reviews. Most editors get 2 reviews. I think it's a service that publishers provide to the academy. Of course, the review process it's this self-correcting mechanism, if you will, self-governing mechanism, but it behooves us to publish the best possible book. And one way of doing that is to get, within reason, as many reviews as possible, and from excellent reviewers. Because reviewing can be a rubber stamp process. I suppose never could game the system and seek reviewers who they know are going to be favorable to the work. But you want criticism. You want, as long as it's fair, it's intelligent, and you want the best possible book at the end of the day. And so I think that's really important. Editors go the extra mile, as they say, to get the best possible work, which means perhaps being willing to review a manuscript that's not quite ready for prime time, but the core is there. And for some reason, the young scholar hasn't yet brought it out, the argument, let's say, at the best aspects of this nascent book. But you see that, and you get these reviews, get 3, in case a type review is necessary. And if you get positive reviews, and there will always be some criticism, of course, you bring it before the editorial meeting. That's usually in Cambridge. It's an internal meeting. And if it passes muster, it goes before the governing body, the syndicate at Cambridge. But I find it pleasurable or gratifying to work with researchers who, for example, haven't quite got where they need to be with regarding this first book. And you know it's going to take time, but you know that they're up for the task and they're going to work hard and you're going to get those reviews. There are too many reservations for it to go on to the editorial meeting. So you send it out for a revise and resubmit. Let's say if there's a lot of criticism, say, well, I'd like to keep working on this. I'd like to keep working with you. You go back, take these initial reviews, the input, revise, resubmit. And normally what women do is send then the revised manuscript to one of the original readers for a thumbs up or thumbs down review. And at the end of the day, you publish a really good book. And this person will get tenure, hopefully, right?
Is it ever the case that you are unable to accept a book because you're already at max capacity? Or are you able to accept anything that meets the standard, regardless of how? Of course, there is a limit. You are a human, but as far as imposed numerical goals, you're able to accept any book that meets the criteria and standard.
Yes.
Beautiful.
I've never encountered a situation where my boss said, Rob, we publish too much in this area. Let's not do any more if it's excellent. Try your best to publish it, and why wouldn't you? So, but I can see that happening in smaller university presses, for sure. Yeah. And one makes all kinds of micro choices. That's the way to put it. This subfield's heavily published in this particular line of inquiry, and the last thing we need is another book on Donald Trump, let's say. There's too much out there, a lot of noise, and what more could be said. But that's very rare, I think.
Mm-hmm. This is more of a general overview of academic publishing and the process, and so that scholars can get an idea of what it looks like on the editorial side. But if they want more information, more specifics about this process, are there additional resources? I know that you actually, the way we got connected was you came to Princeton to give a talk to some of our visiting fellows about how to turn a dissertation into a book. But are there other resources that scholars not at Princeton would be able to access?
For sure. Lots of them. Myriad resources.
They're
in the book form, on the internet, amidst one's department colleagues. And this is why where this talk is occurring, I think, and why I give this talk around the world on writing the first book or turning your dissertation into a book, because these questions are myriad and perennial, despite all the resources out there. So, for example, we have, as I mentioned, this model, Elements, which pulls from the best of journals, best of books. And I'm just now starting an Elements series on successful publishing in the social sciences. And it'll be a very popular Elements series. It's going to be unusual because the content won't be research.
Yeah.
It'll be a very practical series. And I've gotten the reviews. So we get, for a series like that, as with a book series, you get more reviews. In this case, I have 7 or 8 reviews from around the world. And as I said, it would be very popular because these questions are unceasing.
Well, and doing something for the first time is always has the most mental labor, because you're forging those pathways in your mind and in your personality about what is possible and what could happen and just navigating the space. So getting even just our conversation today is really helpful. I'd love to pivot a little bit. We've been talking about the how publishing works for the authors or potential authors, but how did you get to your editorial work here and come to the focus of social sciences and political theory?
Yes, I do. At Cambridge, I do the publisher of economics. And in political science, political theory, political economy, I do the methods, quantitative, qualitative, and this methods is social sciences. Understanding that my colleagues, those of us on this team, the politics and economics team, there's crossover. So those are the main areas, political theory, as I said. I came up through trade publishing. I was an editor at Penguin, and after Penguin, Harcourt, doing both fiction and nonfiction, more serious nonfiction, more literary fiction, I suppose. Commercial publishing needs this young and it's old, as I always say. And no matter how good you are, you will probably be made redundant at some point in your career. It's very competitive. It's, of course, more remunerative than scholarly publishing. It's more glamorous. It calls on more creativity. You make good dinner table conversation because you work with, at least I did, because that's fortunate, well-known authors, and you have good stories. It's exciting. You take agents out to lunch and so forth. But can be dangerous too, to the extent that you identify with it. Makes you often more interesting, perhaps, than
you might actually be.
Yeah, and I felt that. And so I was always aware of that and aware of identifying to an extraordinary degree with what I did at my peril. And I have a close friend who works here in journalist publishing and knew that I was looking to move on. I'd been at the director of the Reader's Subscription, which is a book enterprise on a started by Auden and Lionel Trilling and the great historian Jacques Barzoun. And that was after Harcourt, and that was a lot of fun. But that world was dying, ceasing to exist, and largely it doesn't anymore. And my friend actually coming to Cambridge. And I actually started as a journals editor. I knew nothing about journals, nothing at all. I knew nothing about scholarly publishing. Gone to graduate school, but that's it. And commissioned journals for 5 years, and now 15 years in book publishing. You engage with content in book publishing much more than you do in journals, of course, which is what I wanted. And books are my vocation, my avocation, and it suited me more than journals publishing. But journals publishing is amazing, and they have an amazing team, very cohesive, first rank here at Cambridge, and I'm forever grateful to have been included in that as part of that team at some point, at least, and entered into the academic publishing.
Yeah. As you work with young scholars and you work with authors, are there any misconceptions that you encounter frequently about the process of publishing, or a conception of, what their responsibility to bring to the table is?
Sure. I would say that it's turning that dissertation into a book. It is not an empty request on behalf of publishers like Cambridge. It never was, and it never will be. And one is always surprised that still is not recognized as to the level it should be, doing the whole job, what's required to turn that dissertation into a book. And I suppose that is most common. But also just the process of finding a publisher and doing the work. One needs to talk to one's peers and, simply how to write that first book. I'm not sure these self-help books, so-called self-help books, whether that's the way of going about it. What I suggest often is your coder. Talk to your colleagues who wrote first books and that are award winners, let's say. Just talk to them and read those books. I think that's always it. As with poetry, so with scholarship, right? There's a way of getting closer to it by engaging with the content someone else has produced. And doing your work, because it's not, as I said, it's not enough just to find the publisher you want to publish with, but make sure you have the right editor. Make sure you have an editor who's collaborative, an editor who is going to make space for your book and make it endure after it's off press. I've always said, and sometimes it's taken perhaps wrongly, that publishing begins when a book's off press. It's too easy to wash your hands of a project once it goes into production because you're not quite as involved as you were therefore. But it's when books off press that a book needs the editor to stay engaged. Of course, the publicists, the marketers, they're excellent and they do good work. And the editor at Cambridge, and I think at most presses. But an editor needs to stay involved and, as I said, make sure the book doesn't get lost, because excellence gets lost amidst excellence. And we do publish more books here at Cambridge than, say, at Princeton. So it's possible a book could get lost. And it remains that I can't give the attention, always same attention to every book, monograph, very specialized monograph, the same methods. I just can't give that as much attention, perhaps. But you do keep an eye on your...
I resonate, though, with what you say about talking to your colleagues. I had a mentor, or maybe it was a podcast, somebody said to me, when you're faced with some project that you're wanting direction for, or you think you need direction for, and you kind of go internal and you're like, I'm going to sit down and I'm just going to think about it really hard. And this person said, if the answer was in you, you would have already had it. So go out and start telling people, and it will start to be reflected back to you. And you'll get that new information that you need to start actually sculpting it into what you hope to envision. You've read a lot of books, I bet, over your time. And I'm not going to ask you to pick one of your favorite books that you've ever published, because that would be like asking a parent to pick their favorite child on a recorded line, which we all know they have them, but we aren't going to talk about that. But tell me, who are 2 or 3 of your favorite authors outside of the work that you do?
Outside of the work, you mean
like books you haven't read because somebody sent it to you, but who you pick up of your own accord when you're not at work, if you do?
Well, I don't. And when you said you preface your question with this would be a favorite, I think for someone, if I may, who reads a lot, or someone who listens to a lot of music, someone who sees a lot of movies, it's hard to. Favorites are for amateurs. My children, my son, particularly a puppy, when he was young, what's your favorite horse, right? What's your favorite breed? What's your favorite dog breed? And I'd say that's hard to answer. Or what's your favorite book? It's hard to answer if you read a lot, or if you ride a lot of horses and you're around a lot of horses or dogs, and there's a time for this particular horse or that particular dog, or a time in which you would like to read this book or that book. So I don't have favorites. And I have difficulty answering the question.
How about this way? Are there any books that you have come back to throughout the years that you revisit? Sometimes people will pick up one that or a few that circulate, even though they've already experienced it, but they come back to experience it again.
Yes, certainly poetry and different poets, if not different books, definitely poetry. Richard Rorty, the philosopher, his work I go back to often. Prima Levi. I go back to Prima Levi quite a lot. If This Was Man, Periodic Table, Truth. The classics, of course, all of the classics. I then rereading Lampedusa's The Leper, for example, which I'm told they just made a series of, looking for content. They need content. That's a good example. I'll tell you that Sheila Heti, Heti, beautiful book called Colors. I think it's Colours, Pure Color. Beautiful novel that one of the few times where I read it, started over immediately and reread it. Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders is another book I've done that for. So I think that's the best way for me to answer that question. Yeah. Are those my favorite books? No. I can find lots of others that might be, but certainly important books. And if the indication is you finish it and go right back immediately to reread, that very few books have I done that with. Mm-hmm. Those two I have.
Yeah. This might be too close to the favorite question, but is there a book or a type of book that you wish someone would write and pitch to you?
Scholarly book.
Scholarly book.
It's a hard question. It's a hard question to answer because it's a hard question to answer because actually if I did have that book, I would have already acted on it. If I had that book in mind, I would have gone out and found someone to write it. I wouldn't have to think about that. Nothing comes to mind. Is probably the answer.
And I think that actually reads to your a sense of appreciation for the experience at hand, and not necessarily something you're going out into the world to sculpt yourself. Like in regards to the favorites, it's not, there is this one favorite thing and I will go pursue it. It's being able to appreciate the subtleties and the individual experience of whatever that thing is. And similarly, in how I'm hearing your strategy of sourcing material for publication is witnessing what comes to you with that eye, as opposed to having a preconceived notion of what needed to be published.
Yes, thank you for saying that. I do have a strong idea of what I want to publish, and there's a phrase I use quite often. My colleagues have probably before with me using an existing impossibility. I think as an editor, that's what I do to the largest extent possible, existing impossibility. And doing so presents more opportunities. And I can only say that only until I'm in front of a scholar and talking do I say, there's a book there. I want you to write a book on this. Mm-hmm. Only until I am reading The Atlantic or The Economist, Financial Times, there's a book there. that happens a lot. And I think that emerges, they're not mutually exclusive, but that emerges from being a trade editor where you read deliberately all the time across all these different mediums, if you will. You read deliberately because you are all at existing possibility about, is there a book there? Is there a book there? Everyone wants to get there first and not always rely on agents to get there, because that's what agents do too. They read deliberately, right? In academic publishing, it's more complicated. And but I've gotten lucky. We're writing economists because they wrote an article for the Financial Times and no one had contacted them. And you write them and they're flattered, first of all, and then maybe they write a book for you and you do get lucky.
Well, this has been really interesting for me to get a deeper understanding of academic publishing. And I think our listenership, which does cater to a large academic audience, will also find interest in this. So thank you so much for coming on today's episode.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in on today's episode of Madison's Notes. If you're interested in more content that focuses on the academic thought of politics, philosophy, and society, then make sure to follow us on your preferred listening platform and find us on social media under the James Madison Program. Madison's Notes is researched, hosted, produced, edited, and engineered by me. My name is Laura Laurent, and if you have comments or ideas for future guests or episodes, feel free to reach out to me through the James Madison Program social media. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.